Hello, everybody. Welcome to the public information briefing for the Onyx Ranch South Fork Valley Water Project. My name is Dan Bartel with the Rosedale-Rio Water Storage District, and I'm joined today with Kern Northcuttt, who's our project manager on our environmental process. So we'd like to welcome you to our briefing.
Hi, I'm happy to be here, and hopefully we'll be able to review the CEQA process and help people be able to review the draft EIR, and so they can make comments on our document.
So our environmental process has been affected by the COVID-19 changes, along with just about everything else in society today. So in response to that, we've made a few changes to our process. One of those changes is taking the normal 45-day review process for the public and extending that to 60 days, just to give you folks a few more days to review the document. And then also, instead of a in-person briefing that we normally do at a school or a public forum, we've had to do this via video. So if you're watching this, this is our public briefing on the draft EIR. So who is Rosedale-Rio Water Storage District? We're a water storage district formed under the California Water Code. We were formed in 1959 by a group of the landowners here in our district to construct and operate a groundwater recharge project. So they had experienced lowering groundwater levels and wanted to contract and import water supply to augment their operations, and so they formed the water district. So as part of that, we have a publicly elected board of directors, and they represent our service area. And our water district will operate as the lead agency for this draft environmental impact report, and that's consistent with California Environmental Quality Act. So our CEQA team, what we do is I'm assigned to be the liaison with the environmental team, and we've hired Kern Northcuttt and Associates to act as the project manager, considering their expertise and experience up in the Kern River Valley. And we've also hired a company called ESA. They prepare environmental impact reports and have done a great job so far on this effort. And then there's also a host of other technical experts that we subcontract with to help with things like cultural studies, hydrogeological studies, to help support and add a lot of analysis to the EIR. So the purpose of today's presentation is to review with the community the CEQA process and how you can participate. Also to review the description of the project itself and how it's addressed in the EIR, and what alternatives that we looked at and what the proposed project is. And lastly, to describe how the environmental analysis is presented in the draft environmental impact report. It's a lengthy document, so we're hoping that this briefing helps you review the document and make sense of it.
The CEQA process has been quite lengthy. We started this back in 2018, and we had the initial study and the notice of preparation of the draft EIR, and that was mailed out to agencies and the public. And during that review time for the 30-day review for the notice of preparation, we had a scoping meeting, and that was held out in the South Fork. And from that, we used the comments that we received to make sure that issues that the public had or concerns that they had were addressed in either the technical studies and in the sections of the draft environmental impact report. Once we had the close of the 30-day comment period, those technical studies began, and then we prepared the draft EIR. Now that the document is complete, the notice of availability of the document has been distributed to the public and then sent up to the state clearinghouse and also filed with the Kern County Clerk's office. And the document is, as Dan mentioned, is available now for a 60-day review period rather than a 45-day review period. So the review period for the draft began on May the 27th, and it will close in 60 days. Now, so everyone has an opportunity to submit written comments through July the 27th. Once that happens, we'll prepare the final environmental impact report, and that includes responding to all the comments that have been received. Once the comments are received, if there's any addendums that are needed to be made to the final EIR, that will occur. And then the Rosedale-Rio Bravo Water Storage District Board of Directors will hold a public hearing. They will take testimony, and then they'll consider whether or not to certify the final EIR. We think that might occur in September, but that will depend on the length and the extent of the comments that are received on the draft environmental impact report. However, once the board of directors certifies the document, then those things will be posted, and the final document will be posted at the state clearinghouse and the county clerk.
So just a little bit about how that hearing will work. Currently, our board is meeting in person, but the capacity of our room is only 10 people because of COVID restrictions. So we do offer our board meetings on Zoom. So to the extent that you want to participate in that public hearing in September or October later this year, you can keep an eye on our website and see when it's listed on the agenda. And on the agenda, it has the information on how to log on to the Zoom meeting so you can participate.
So right now, the draft is available on the Rosedale-Rio Bravo Water Storage District's website, but also everyone who commented or signed in at the scoping meeting or were involved in any sort of a comment on the notice of preparation, you all received USB flash drives. Those were mailed directly to agencies, organizations, and individuals as long as we could read your name and or address. Sometimes I think there was some hieroglyphics involved, but we've tried to decipher those, and they are also available at those two websites that you see on the screen, at the Rosedale-Rio Bravo Water Storage District and also at onyxranch.org. So you can go to those two websites. And if the libraries reopen, the documents have also been sent to the library in Wofford Heights, the one in Lake Isabella, and also at the Beale Memorial Library in Bakersfield. So, and if the libraries may reopen before the close of the comment period, so they are always there. Now, all the written comments should be either sent by mail or faxed to Dan Bartel, and then the address is up on the screen, and we'll have this again at the very end. So,
and if folks have not received the draft EIR report, either by thumb drive or unable to get it off the website, you can always contact me. My email address and is there below, as well as our address. So contact me, and we'll mail you a thumb drive of the document.
I think now Dan is going to describe the project that was actually analyzed in the draft EIR.
So regional location. So you'll find this figure within the draft EIR, and so you'll see the project site up to the middle and right, and that's where the properties are located in the South Fork Valley. Just to the west of that is Isabella Reservoir, which all of you are well aware, and then the lower Kern River Canyon, and the river flows down to Bakersfield, and you can see in dashed black lines on the figure where our water district is located west of Bakersfield out to Interstate 5. So just a little zoom up of the area, kind of in the orangish salmon color. Forgive me, I'm a little colorblind, so that's the way I see it, but there are dashed lines around the project site. So those are the properties that the district has acquired either in whole or as in part, and is part of the project site. So that includes the Onyx Ranch, historical Onyx Ranch in the South Fork area, as well as the Smith Ranch. And you can see to the west is Isabella Reservoir and the different communities, Kernville, Wofford Heights, Lake Isabella, Weldon, and Onyx. So that gives you a little feeling for where the project site is. And it's primarily between the community of Weldon and Onyx. So as we designed the project, first we set out project objectives, and these kind of led how we developed the project out. And so these are really important to the environmental analysis. So the first thing is to maximize the beneficial use of water and water rights associated with both ranches here in Kern County. We knew these properties were up for sale, and so we didn't want these to go to Los Angeles County or San Bernardino County, and we wanted to make sure they stayed here. So the district acquired rights in those two properties. And so we want to make sure that the rights are beneficially used, and that's consistent with the California state constitution. The other thing that's been impacted by most water districts in California is the issues up in the Sacramento-San Joaquin Delta. So I'm sure you've heard about the Delta smelt and all the environmental concerns surrounding the Delta. Much of the water in California comes through that Delta, and as they've had environmental concerns, our water supplies have been cut over the last 20 to 30 years. And so we're looking for a cost-effective long-term method to replace the amount of water that the district has lost through the State Water Project. So absent those issues in the Delta and the cuts to our contracts on the State Water Project, we would have no need to go out looking for other supplies. But because of that, we've had to look at alternatives. And this project is one of those alternatives. So the other project objective was to allow Rosedale to utilize these water rights from the Onyx Ranch and Smith Ranch to maximize our groundwater replenishment down in the Kern County subbasin. So as I explained earlier, the district was formed in 1959 to do this very thing. And so we want to use that water in our service area and assist us with meeting our sustainability goals. So in 2014, new legislation was passed in California and signed by the governor called CEQA. You may have heard of this. It's called the Sustainability Groundwater Management Act. And as part of that, we have to balance our supplies and demands. And so part of us balancing that supply and demand because of our loss of State Water Project water, we're looking to develop water supplies associated with the Onyx Ranch and Smith Ranch in the South Fork Valley. So one of the things we heard as we acquired the property, which was very important to the community, and the cause of much rumor was, would the water district build a pipeline and pipe the water down to the district or pipe the water to Southern California? And the answer to that is no. One of our objectives is to increase flows in the South Fork. There had been environmental concerns about reduced flows in the South Fork and how that affected environmental concerns. So we had made it an objective to make sure if we moved any water from the ranch that it would continue down the South Fork of the Kern River and within existing habitat areas. So we heard the community loud and clear very early on after acquisition, so we made that part of one of our objectives. So the last two objectives is to incorporate different elements of the project to address potential environmental effects. And so anytime we do a project, there's all kinds of effects of that project. So we wanted to make sure before just designing a project and then seeing what bad things it did, is that we wanted to be proactive and incorporate elements that would preclude a lot of those negative impacts. So some of those project elements help us avoid unreasonable effects on fish, wildlife, and other in-stream beneficial uses. Some of those elements also help not unreasonably affecting the overall economy of the South Fork and the Kern River Valley. And lastly, we didn't want to injure other legal users and get into a legal battle with other users of the South Fork of the Kern River. And so all these are project elements, and they were built into our project description, so we'd preclude these issues. So now for the project description. It's a very simple project description. The district proposes to redirect the water that would have been diverted for use on the project site, which is the Onyx Ranch and a portion of the Smith Ranch. And that water would merely remain in the South Fork Kern River and flow downstream down the Kern River through Lake Isabella and into the Rosedale service area for irrigation and groundwater recharge. On the project site, which is the Onyx Ranch and Smith Ranch, The fields would be the irrigated fields, ag fields like alfalfa and other crops that you see, would be converted from irrigated ag into non-irrigated pastures or returned to their native vegetative state. So that's what the land would look like, is a transition to from irrigated crops to non-irrigated pastures. So the last thing that's really important to the project description and is really a result of the NOP process was the Rosedale Water District will not pump groundwater to meet the irrigation demand, meaning we won't replace the surface water that is going to remain in the river with groundwater. So that was a comment, many comments received in the NOP process, and we clarified that it wasn't our intention to pump groundwater and replace it, but we clarified that really clearly in the draft EIR for the public to see. So there's no confusion about that issue. So we're going to talk about water and we're going to talk about land management. So the Onyx Ranch will be transitioned to non-irrigated pasture. And this will be achieved by planting vegetation capable of surviving under natural precipitation regime. So we're doing pilot projects as we speak. We've transitioned some of those fields into non-irrigated pastures, and you drive through the area, you'll see some of those. And so that's a transition that can take anywhere from 0 to 3 years as we let old alfalfa fields kind of fade out and replace it with either natural grasses or new pasture grasses that will do better under a non-irrigated regime. And then on the Smith Ranch, it's a little bit different, meaning we're a third owner on that ranch. And so the way that's going to look is a third of the water will be moved downstream to the district, and then a third of the land will be reduced as far as irrigated acreage. So the other owners on the ranch, they can either fallow long-term 1/3 of that ranch, or they can rotate that fallowing around year to year, depending on their decisions on those management actions. So one of the things that came up during the environmental analysis was, to the extent that we go to non-irrigated pastures, often the livestock survive off of the water supply that's going down the irrigation ditches as far as drinking supply. And so as we reduce the amount of water flowing down those ditches, we had to come up with alternative water supplies. There's several places on the ranch that we already do this, where we have shallow stock water wells with solar panels. You may have seen those on the ranch as you drive down Highway 178. But we anticipate that we'll have to install up to 12 shallow, low volume solar powered wells to augment the stock water supply. So these are very small wells, drilled only 20 to 50 foot deep, and they pump about 2 to 5 gallons a minute. And then we have a storage tank and troughs for the stock to drink off of. I guess I should have silenced my phone. Sorry about that. All right, so that's the land management strategy in a nutshell. As far as the flow methodology, so how do we calculate how much water remains in the South Fork and ends up in the reservoir and flows down into the district recharge areas? So we've come up with a methodology for that. So the first step is looking at the water rights, and sometimes we call this paper water. So on a given day, depending on the flow of the South Fork, how much water is available to the district water rights based on the flow of the river. And so that's one calculation we make. And the other calculation we make is how much is our typical demand. Because the amount available to the ranch is sometimes higher than what the typical demand is, we always make sure to take, as far as project water supply is to take the lesser of these two numbers. So even though the water right on paper supplies a one number, we kind of cap that number at our typical irrigation demand. And so we take the lower of those two numbers. And that would be the amount of water that's being redirected down the South Fork. So that's the amount of water that we would have been diverting that would now go down to the South Fork or remain in the South Fork and end up in Lake Isabella. So the question is, how much of that water ends up in the reservoir? So what we did was we developed a calibrated groundwater surface model. This is a computer model that would estimate the losses that we would need to deduct from these flows. So there was two reasons that we developed that model. One was in response to the public. There was concerns about groundwater impacts in the area and how this project may impact domestic and municipal wells in the area. So we developed a groundwater model, so it helped us with two things. One, to evaluate what those impacts would be, and two, to estimate how much water would actually end up in the reservoir. So we had a study period from 2005 to 2017, and we ran that model with the project and without the project. And on average, we redirected 7,265 acre feet per year. And of those flows, 6,014 acre feet per year ended up in the reservoir on average. So we call this a no injury factor. So the difference between these two numbers is how much water is lost to the system and doesn't end up in the reservoir. It's not lost, it just goes to other things. And so we call this the no injury factor, and it's 17% of the flows. So what we do is we take the redirected flows, multiply by 0.83 to account for these system losses or system changes, and that's the amount of water that would end up in Isabella Reservoir on a daily basis. So once we have that calculation, that water is released in and through Isabella Dam and flows downstream in the lower Kern River channel, and then would eventually be diverted at Rosedale's other diversion points along the river channel. We'll work with different official or different agencies, whether it's the City of Bakersfield, Kern County Water Agency, and other Kern River water right holders down here in the San Joaquin Valley to work out those diversions and operations along with the Kern River Water Master. So there'll be a whole process that we'll work through on that. So once we get into our diversion point, then the district would deliver that water into its recharge basins and channels, both for direct recharge for the aquifer and irrigation, and that would help to offset our service area needs here in the San Joaquin Valley. I think it's back to you, Karen.
Okay, now this is the fun part. This is how to wade through this whole big document. First of all, you sort of need to understand what's in the draft EIR. The document includes a very detailed description of the proposed project, including all the actions and the approvals that are needed for this thing to move forward. There's also an analysis of the project-specific and cumulative environmental impacts of the project. And every section that is analyzed has this type of analysis. There's also where there were potential impacts, then there are mitigation measures that have been identified to reduce or avoid all the significant impacts of the proposed project. And then, as Dan mentioned earlier, there is an analysis of alternatives that are analyzed that are different from the proposed project that would reduce any identified significant impacts. And in addition to what you see on the slide here, there's also a technical appendices that accompanies this. And the technical appendices has the initial study, the notice of preparation documents. It has copies of all the comment letters that were received, and it has copies of the technical reports that were prepared. So when you get your thumb drive, or if you see a hard copy, you'll see the draft EIR in one volume, and then the technical appendices, which is equally as large, is in a separate volume. Now, within section 3 of the draft EIR are the environmental topics that were analyzed, and there were 13 of them. There were some that were focused out as a result of the process that was identified through the notice of preparation, but we analyzed these 13: aesthetics, agriculture, air quality, biological resources, cultural resources. We have geology and soils, and that also includes the potential For paleontological resources, we had to analyze greenhouse gas emissions, hazards and hazardous materials. We certainly analyzed hydrology and water quality, and that included impacts to groundwater as well as flooding that would result from leaving water in the river. We analyzed land use and planning, population and employment, tribal and cultural resources, which is a new section that's only recently been added as a requirement for environmental documents. And then in section 3-15, we have the utilities, service systems, and energy, and that's where a lot of the discussion about water rights occurs. So when you get to analyzing and looking at each individual section, you'll notice that they all have the same format. So we do that so you're not jumping around and every topic has a different format. So the first thing is that you will have a discussion of the environmental setting. And you do that because in some situations, the environmental setting might be a little bit larger than just the acreage that's involved in the project. So the environmental setting for each topic is specifically identified. Then we describe the regulatory framework. And sometimes that is different because the regulations and laws that are in place that govern different topics, you need to look at those things and make sure that what the project is being proposed complies with all the regulations that are already in place. And then after that regulatory framework is described, there's the impact analysis and the mitigation measures. And we have the thresholds of significance, which is the first topic before you start doing the analysis. And those are taken from the CEQA document guidelines, CEQA guidelines, as well as any specific thresholds that the district has. Then we describe the methodology. Obviously, the methodology for biology is different than the hydrology. And so there's a discussion of the methodology so it's really clear how the analysis was conducted. And then we have the project analysis, and that's for the project-specific impacts as well as any mitigation measures. And then we describe cumulative impacts for other projects that are ongoing. And then at the very end, so that it's really clear as to for people to understand the impacts, there is a summary of each impact analysis, and that's located right at the very end of each section. There's also a reference section at the end of each of the environmental topics so that you have an opportunity to go back and look at the sources for the information that have been cited throughout the analysis. So every section in the EIR has all of this. That's one of the reasons it's so big.
And if you don't want to read all the sections, there's an executive summary at the front end, which has a summary of all of these things for each of the different analyses.
That's correct, yeah. And as a matter of fact,
if you have a sleeping problem, read the whole document.
Yeah, if you're having insomnia, it would be good to read the whole document. And if you just want to get an idea of which topics might be of interest, I would, in your process for reviewing the environmental document, do read the executive summary first. It's right at the very front of the document. You get a sense of what issues were addressed and the impacts. And then if some seem like, okay, well, they took care of that, then you might want to skip that particular topic and just focus on the ones that are of interest to you, because all the topics are pretty lengthy and thorough. So of all the impacts that were identified, there were 10 that were analyzed that would either have no impact or a less than significant impact. And sometimes just implementing the regulations that the government has in place for how issues are treated was what resulted in a no impact or a less than significant impact. And that was particularly critical for things like air quality, greenhouse gas emissions, also for hazardous and hazardous materials and how those were handled. We also looked at hydrology and water quality. And just as a highlight, in the analysis in hydrology and water quality, the The groundwater model that was done, and that whole modeling report is in the technical appendices, determined that less than 2 feet of impact would occur to groundwater levels, even during low water conditions. We also looked at land use and planning. There was some concern about that this whole project would result in the loss of jobs in the region. At a maximum, the project determined there would only be 2 ag positions, but it could increase existing recreational businesses because there would be a little bit more water in the lake. And then there was also, in the utilities, service systems, and energy, a determination that there would be no effect on the availability of water supply to others who rely on groundwater in the area. There were, however, 3 topics that were identified that could have some significant impacts, and those were biological resources, cultural resources, and geology and soils, really the paleontological resources. However, after all the mitigation measures were identified and in place, as those are implemented, the studies determined that the impacts to these 3 topics would be less than significant. I'll go through just the impacts that were identified. So first, let me talk about biological resources. Obviously, the project would reduce or eliminate the flow of irrigation water through a lot of those ditches that are on the project site. Although, as a matter of the analysis, a lot of those ditches will continue to have water in them because those ditches supply water to other area landowners that are off the project site. However, with a reduction in the water flow in the ditches, there could be an impact to breeding and foraging habitat for the tricolored blackbird and the Kern redwing blackbird, and those have been identified as sensitive bird species. The reduction in water could also have an impact on the alkali Mariposa lily, and also the habitat for some not only species like the flycatcher and the yellow-billed cuckoo, but also on some vegetation, the red willow thickets, mule fat thickets, some cattail marshes, and some sandbar willow thickets. The reduced water could also impact wildlife movement from riparian habitat loss or decline. Wildlife would just no longer have these habitats to use, and so they might go elsewhere. And then also the riparian habitats could be reduced for areas that are classified as federal or state protected wetlands. And section 3.6 in the draft EIR is the biological resources section. It's a very lengthy section, has a lot of information about the project site, and that's where all this is discussed. There are mitigation measures that are identified to reduce these impacts, and they're identified. You'll see the mitigation measures have a little code. BIO is for biological resources. There's separate ones for cultural and separate ones for the paleontological. There are 4 for biological resources, and mostly they involve pre-construction or pre-project surveys, and as well as ongoing monitoring. And some, there are a 5-year study regime for these different habitats. They're all to be conducted by qualified biologists, and that as a result of the methodology that's described at length in these sections, because these are just summaries of the mitigation measures, but the actual document itself has a very lengthy description of these mitigation measures, who's responsible, when it has to occur, and what happens if it's determined during the monitoring period that there is an impact. So there's the monitoring for the habitat, riparian habitats for the tricolored blackbirds and avian species. There's also for the creeping ryegrass, turf, alkali mariposa lily, and then for a determination about wetlands, and everything that's described in mitigation measure Bio 1 applies to Bio 4. So again, read those mitigation measures at length, and we think that those were determined to have no impact, or will reduce it to a less than significant impact on biological resources. The next potential impact was to cultural resources. That whole discussion occurs in section 3.7. Now there's one prehistoric lithic scatter that is located in an irrigated field that is proposed for a transition to a non-irrigated pasture. The other impact was that if, as the district is installing the shallow, low volume wells, they could encounter some unanticipated archaeological resources. So that was a potential impact that we have a mitigation to address. Then also, anytime you're doing a project in an area that has had a history of cultural resources on the area, that you could always uncover human remains outside of a formal cemetery. So there are legal requirements about what has to happen, but all of those impacts and the potential mitigation measures are included in section 3.7 of this draft EIR. Now, again, the cultural resource mitigation measures are identified with CUL. So anytime you see those, you'll know that that has to do with cultural. And CLU1 talks about that a qualified archaeologist has to provide oversight for all the well construction. They're going to monitor it, and even prior to them determining where a new solar well for the livestock might occur, that they will do a pre-construction survey, and the goal is to avoid the potential for disturbing any sort of cultural resources by not locating the wells in any area that might have some sensitivity. But just as a belt and suspenders process, that when the wells are constructed, there will be an archaeological monitor on site to make sure that if anything happens or there's any discovery, that work is halted and the resource is addressed. And then during the whole project, if any human remains are discovered, then CLU3 has the lengthy discussion about what happens if you have to call the coroner, the county coroner, and they will come and review this. And there's a process that is established by state law that talks about how this all gets handled. So those are the mitigation measures for cultural resources that would reduce the impacts to a less than significant level.
So Karen, as I read these, we kind of survey the areas before we do the work and select the sites. And then we have monitors on site to keep an eye on things. And to the extent that we find anything, we halt construction and call the right people to come in and help us with those issues. Is that correct?
That's exactly correct. So the third potential impact was to the paleontological resources, which is discussed in the geology and soils. And although this area is not particularly known for having paleontological resources, there is the potential, and CEQA has a question about paleontological resources. So we wanted to make sure that there would be no issues associated with that. So again, a qualified paleontologist will be on site and provide oversight for monitoring when the drilling activities are occurring for these shallow, low volume solar wells. And with that oversight, then there should be no impact to paleontological resources, and that's discussed in section 3.8. Now, one of the things that CEQA does require is the discussion of alternatives to the proposed project. And that issue was certainly brought up during the scoping meeting and during comments received on the NOP. So as the alternatives were reviewed and looked at, there were 3 that were determined and were reviewed and determined to be rejected and didn't have any analysis because they weren't feasible or they didn't meet the project objectives. However, there were 2 that were selected, and those 2 have a very detailed analysis in an alternative section of the EIR. One of them was no project alternative, and CEQA requires that all environmental documents do an analysis of what would happen if you didn't do the project. So this process and this environmental document also did that and looked at what would occur if nothing happened. The other project that received thorough analysis was what would happen if the water district only diverted 50%, left that in the river versus having the 50% diversion occur to the water through the ditches and used 50% of the water on the site from surface water sources. So that was analyzed, and although it was determined that the 50% diversion alternative was selected as the most environmentally superior alternative, it was determined that that alternative was not feasible because it didn't meet the project objectives. And that's one of the criteria for determining the feasibility of the alternatives, is that if it doesn't meet the project objectives, then it cannot be selected as the preferred alternative. So section 5.1 has that discussion of all the alternatives, and that's where you can go to take a look at all of that. So there'll be a review of the draft. We're encouraging you to submit written comments, and I will turn it back over to Dan.
Yeah, so on July 27th, 2020, all written comments are due. So we'll take comments till the end of the day on July 27th. So please get your comments in. By then, it's the same contact that was previously in the PowerPoint presentation. So you see my email address there and fax number. And then this presentation will be posted on our websites, which is rrbwsd.com and onyxranch.org. So you'll be able to see this presentation there and share it if you like. And then again, the date for our Rosedale board meeting, which is a hearing. So that's where you can provide verbal comments if you wish. We anticipate that to be in September, but that'll depend on how long it takes us to respond to comments and finalize the EIR. Right now we anticipate September, but that's always, that's up for scheduling and getting the work done in preparation for that. So to find out when that meeting is, you'll need to keep an eye on our district board meeting agendas. So you'll find those at rrbwsd.com and look under notices. So every month we post our agendas for the board meeting, so keep an eye out for that. Generally, our board meetings are the second Tuesday of the month, but occasionally we have special board meetings where we change those dates. So you just have to kind of keep your eye on the website for the posting for the hearing. So we do that all. Go ahead, Karen.
And to just add that before the board hearing, the response to comments and the final EIR document will be posted to that district website. So keep checking back, and so that you can see all the comments, how the comments were addressed, and then a copy of the final EIR, and that will be on both of those websites. So take a look at that.
That's a good point, Karen. So your comments due on the draft EIR or July 27th, then we'll publish a final EIR. And so that hearing is really to hear comments on the final EIR.
That's correct.
So, and those can be verbal or written. So anyways, that's really the process. And we thank you all for your participation and attention to this process. We've been at it for several years now. The district did go slow on this project. We wanted to develop the project in a wise way so as to preclude impacts And then as we did our environmental analysis, make sure that we covered all our bases. So Karen has helped us out immensely with that and done a great job, along with Jennifer Jacobus and the ESA team. And we're proud to have a draft EIR out that we feel either has no impacts or has mitigation measures to deal with any significant impacts. So with that, we thank you for your participation and look forward to your comments.